Hello everyone and welcome to the first Insta-Live guided tour of the Museum of Finnish Architecture. I hope you can hear me. We are starting here outside. My name is Aapo and I've just started out here as a museum pedagogue and I will be giving you the tour. And I can't see the comments right now, but I have my coworker Ida here behind the camera, so if you have any questions or comments, just please don't hesitate to give them here and she will pass them on to me. Yes. So, as you can see, we are here outside the museum. And I was thinking I could first talk a little bit about the museum itself and the building, because it's kind of an interesting one, and then we will go upstairs to the main exhibition that is called The Cultivated Landscapes of Alvar Aalto. So if that's okay, we can start. The building was designed in 1899, so it just had its 120th birthday, and the architect was Magnus Skärpek, whose sister Helen Skärpek is a very famous Finnish painter. And the style is quite pompous, it's quite over the top kind of, it's neo-Renaissance style, and the funny thing is that it's kind of this cube, and it wasn't supposed to be this way originally. We were supposed to have, on both sides of the building, we were supposed to have built annexes. But those were never built. I guess they didn't have finances for them at the time. So it's just this cube at the moment, and we will see what's inside. But the details are very nice, and it's a very, how do you say, a very good example of a neo-Renaissance building, which imitates the actual Renaissance, which in its turn imitates kind of the antiquity. So we can see all those things here. But it's getting cold outside, so I think we could go in. Just follow me. Okay, so just come inside, let's make ourselves cozy. Here we are in the lobby of the museum, and this is the most remarkable place maybe of the building, and this is another funny part of the building, because the wings on both sides of the building were never built, so 1/4 of this building is the staircase. It's quite remarkable. If you can see some of the details here, it's a very, very nice staircase. Of course, it's very nice to look at, but it means that we don't have so much exhibition space because of the shape of the building. But the details are quite nice, because I'm not sure if you can see, but one thing that I first noticed was this marble rock or marble that we have here in the interiors, but it's actually not marble, it's painted to look like marble, and that's a trick that they used, because the marble, the actual marble, the real thing, was so expensive a material at the time. But anyway, we are more than just a staircase. We have a huge collection. We are one of the oldest architecture or museums that are dedicated to architecture. I think only one older one is the Moscow Museum of Architecture. But anyway, we kind of focus on 20th century architecture, and we have 500,000 drawings, architectural drawings, and then we have 500 scale models, and we have 120,000 photographs of finished buildings, and those are in the collections. And one of the scale models is here now in the lobby. This is a famous Finnish architecture's Elia Saarinen's Chicago Tribune Tower. And this is a nice example of the collections because we kind of focus on the process of architecture more than the actual finished buildings only. And it's nice to get this, how would you say, like behind the scenes views of how the design process goes. And this is an example of that because Elia Saarinen took part to the architecture competition and he came in second, so the actual building never got realized, but we still have the plans and the designs that he made, and this is a newer scale model of those plans. So we could go upstairs to the actual exhibition. You can follow me. And maybe have a look at some of the details of the building at the same time. Come closer, yes. It's very nice to have the whole museum to ourselves at the moment because there's no one here. So this is the cultivated landscape of Alvar Aalto. We have our main exhibition hall here and then the smaller one. And I guess Alvar Aalto is, at least if you're a Finnish person, everyone knows him because he's probably the most famous Finnish architect. And he has also designed some furniture like these chairs that we have here. There are Alvar Aalto's chairs. But this exhibition actually concentrates on the part of his career that is not so well known, and that is the landscape architectural side of his design. And we could actually start here, or maybe I could say first that this is the last chance, actually, this tour and the next one in Finnish. These are the last chance to see these exhibitions because the museum will be closed and the exhibitions are going to go down. We are going to take them down while the museum is closed. So I will make my best to show you what we have in this exhibition here. So let's go inside this smaller exhibition space. I hope you can hear me well because it's kind of echoing a bit here in this room. So just comment if we have some technical difficulties or stuff like that. This room is dedicated to Alvar Aalto's kind of like influences that he got to this landscape architectural work that he had. Different places where he went, different landscapes that he was familiar with, and how those may have influenced his work that we will see then in the main exhibition space. So Alvar Aalto was born in 1898 in Kuortane in northwestern Finland, Ostrobotnia, I think it's called in English, I'm not sure either. So he was, from his youth, he was very familiar with the plain because the northwestern Finland is very plain, it's very, how do you say, very low landscapes. So until the age of 7, his family lived there and he was playing there. And then they moved to Jyväskylä, and we have some pictures here of those landscapes of his youth. And Jyväskylä is in the central Finland, and it's more like this hilly kind of. It's more, the topography is more varied, and we had there's a lot of lakes and stuff like that. So I think maybe these landscapes are, because for example, if you have lived in some type of landscape as a child, it very much influences your view of how you experience your environment. So maybe this is the way to show what kind of environments Aalto played as a child in, or that type of thing. But let's look at some of the influences of the actual work that he had. The first is Sweden. Aalto, he went, when he was still a student in the 1920s, he went to do an internship in Sweden. You can come closer. And the architect office there, where he was an intern, they were working on Gothenburg World Fair at the time, which was actually in 1923. And this was the time where Aalto got familiar with the whole scale of architectural work, like the smaller details, even the furniture, the very, very little things, and then the huge scale, because it was an outside park area where the pavilions were erected and built. So this was the whole scale of the designing process, and it was where he started his career, kind of. And he also made friends with Swedish architect Gunnar Asplund. And maybe at first it was kind of this, how do you say, like a master-student relationship, but later on they visited each other and maybe got influences from each other also. So Sweden was the first place where he went for international influences. And then we have this very nice, very beautiful scale model, and this is from Italy. Riola in Italy, and this is kind of a metaphor of the whole exhibition that we have here now, because we have just a small pin here where the actual building is later built, but Aalto was commissioned this church in Riola, and he designed it so that he visited the place first and they went sightseeing, but then he designed it in Finland, and the architects in Italy, they made this huge scale model of the whole hillside, of the whole riverside, to give a good example of what kind of topography the place had and what kind of environment it was. And not only this, they also sent huge amounts of soil samples, like rocks from the river and leaves from the plants and stuff like that, and the whole package actually, I think it weighed something like 1,000 kilograms when they shipped it to Finland. So not the most usual way to maybe design a church, but this is maybe shows how important the environment of the building and how that relates to the building was to Aalto. I hope you can see all the intricacies of the small scale model. And then other influences, one very important part of the world is the Mediterranean area, where he and his Aalto and his first wife, Aino Aalto, they traveled a lot, and these are the pictures from Italy are from our Aino Aalto's pictures. And maybe one of the important things was that they Aalto wrote somewhere that when they saw these small hilltop cities, that was the kind of the most organic type of city or town that they may have. And we don't have this type of cities in Finland, though, so this is kind of a very, very maybe even romantic view to us. And then if you can see some pictures of the finished church of Riola, so we have the scale model and then we have the finished church, which was actually built in 1980s after Aalto's death. And it's interesting that many of his work were actually built after his death, and this one was supervised by his second wife, Elisa Aalto, who was also an architect. So in the Mediterranean area, of course, there's lots of very old architecture, and that's something that's always inspired architects and young architects. So they took a lot of pictures of these ruins and ancient architecture. And that's another point to Aalto's work also, that he didn't think that buildings were finished, that they were kind of finished when they were done, when they were built. But the work actually, the building has to live on, it has to stand the test of time, like these buildings in Greece and in ancient Rome were built. So they are very old buildings, and they kind of have showed us how and what kind of materials and what kind of structures will stand the test of time. So they're a good example. And then there is this huge cultural area, the Islamic world, which maybe we can take some highlights out of that. Of course, in Spain there is part of Islamic world, because Andalusia used to be an Islamic part, And then in Islamic architecture there is this thing with the water element, that the water is somehow, of course the vegetation, the plants are always around the water, but it's also something that changes the soundscape, because the flowing waters and the fountains, it gives an atmosphere to the place. So we have some examples from Granada, Alhambra city, of these water elements. And this is something that we can see in Aalto's work later on when we look at it in the main exhibition hall. And I would like to show this. This is interesting also if we think of the hilltop, the Italian hilltop cities that we showed a picture just a minute ago. There is this example of a non-realized project by Aalto. It is the art museum in Shiraz, Iran. And it was designed in late 60s, but it was never realized. They almost finished all of the paperwork, all of the drawings and the designs, but then the political situation changes, as you know. Later in the 70s there was this revolution in Iran, so the design was never actually realized. I've heard that since that time, they have sometimes taken these drawings and maybe thought of realizing them afterwards, but nothing has been done yet. And here you can see a very characteristic of that Aalto's landscape style, that it's kind of, the building kind of floats, it kind of imitates the topography, the contours of the hill line. And lastly, by the influences, but not leastly, we have Japan, where Aalto never traveled himself, but he learned through books, like many other architects. For example, this book here, I'm not sure if you can see it, but it has been a very influential book. It's Tetsuro Yoshida's Das Japanische Wohnhaus. This is a German copy of that. And this is the way that architects in the West kind of applied Japanese ideas, that simplicity or the functionality of those buildings, and translated it into the Western architecture. And even though Aalto never visited Japan himself, he had the chance to see Japanese architecture in Stockholm, where this authentic kind of tea house called Zukite was erected in 1935. So maybe that was a way for him to get familiar with Japanese architecture more. So we can move on, and if you have any comments or questions, please type them in and I will try to answer the best I can. So let's see. We can move to the main exhibition hall to look at some of Aalto's own projects, or his office's projects. I think we can start from that corner. So this is the main exhibition hall, and here are around this exhibition we have these main elements that Aalto used in many of his works, and then the actual projects are in these smaller walls in the middle. But let's go here. So, here we are, and I think the first work we could start is the water element in Aalto's landscape work, and this is this wall is dedicated to that. Some of the some of the designs are sit near natural waters, but some of the water designs are actually built in, that there are pools or other types of water elements that were built in the landscape. And maybe first is the very famous Paimio Sanatorium, and the building itself is very, you can see some small part of that in the background, but the building is not a building that kind of, how would you say, blends to the nature. It's a very much this huge modernistic, international modernistic style building that sits just this white building in the forest, and it kind of like stands out. But the idea was that the gardens were very important to the people in sanatorium, because they weren't able to travel. So these gardens was a huge part of that design. And Aalto had these, how do you say, serpentine pathways that went along the whole garden, and there were these smaller, small water elements there, and we can see some of the nurses standing to see some of the scale of that water element. And then another water element is a very this kidney-shaped pool of Villa Mairea in Noormarkku. And this is, we don't actually know if this is true, but there's an interesting anecdote about this pool, because Aalto knew this United States-based architect called Thomas Church, who in the 40s designed a lot of this type of, how do you say, this type of pools, that the other side is deeper than the other in California. And after a couple of decades in how do we say, I think it's mid-70s, there was a drought in California, no rain for a long time. So many of these basins actually dried out, and skateboarders, the very kind of like the first skateboarders took them because they were out of water, and they made their subculture in those basins there. But we don't know if that was influenced by Aalto. We just know that this type of basin was built in California after that. And here we have, I hope you can see well, some of these images are reflecting so that you can see some of the drawings. Here we have some of that amphitheater design that Aalto used a lot in his landscape work. So it's an idea of this terraced theater, which is very much reminiscent of the antiquity theaters that we maybe saw in the other room. And an interesting detail is that Aalto actually, he didn't include many benches or places to sit in his gardens, but there were almost always there was this kind of some type of terracing or some type of theater that you could actually use as an open space, as an outdoor space. And I think good examples of those kind of theaters are these university buildings that we have in Jyväskylä. Jyväskylä University is the first picture here that we can see, and the second one is Otaniemi University building, which is Aalto University nowadays. And on the other side of that terrace, on the other side of that theater, there's this main lecture hall of the main building. So probably the idea was that you could, if it was nice weather, you could take the lecture outside and give your lecture in the open air. And like I told about the ruins in the other building, that the buildings live on as they are built, and this is something that Aalto already explored while he was designing. We have these drawings of the facades of the buildings, where he has already drawn many of them full of vegetation or plants that would actually take on the building or the facade of the building itself. So it's part of the process. It's not just that it kind of grows on a finished building. The building is never finished as long as it's there. And many of these drawings we don't actually know, or maybe we don't know of the finished drawings that are they Alvar Aalto's individual work, because they are under the name of his office. So we know that Aina Aalto, his first wife, for example, had a huge hand in many of the projects that he was working with, and of course the office in general. So it's very probable that Aalto started or gave the main ideas, and then other architects kind of worked on the details in these projects also. And all the drawings are from Aalto Foundation. These are not from our own collections, because Aalto Foundation is the one that preserves Aalto's drawings. We could take a look at Otaniemi campus a little bit closer. Maybe we have a nice exhibition or exhibit about that. So Otaniemi is the main campus of Aalto University. It's a new amalgam university of 3 universities: the Technical University, the Business University, and the Art and Design University in Finland. And this is a very nice. I think maybe this drawing is the best to show that it's a very green area. It's a very green area, and it was supposed to be so that people who lived there are these student houses and housing for the professors and the staff, and then there's this main building which is in the middle of the area. So it was designed so that people wouldn't have to cross any streets that were, or it was a carless area. There were no cars in here. So the idea is that you could just cross the meadows, you could just cross the plains when you're going to the lecture, and you wouldn't have to worry about cars or anything. So it was very nice, this communal area. And it still is. And we have some pictures here. For example, here we can see that there has been a water basin in there, but it has been, I don't know, it's not there anymore. It has been filled up, and I don't know why, because it kind of helped with the water that was coming from melting snow and stuff like that, but maybe people were bathing in the water too much, so they had to fill it up, I don't know. And the main building of the Otaniemi University was erected on the top of, there was this old manor building. And this is a nice detail on this plan, because the old trees that are in these pictures, Aalto actually marked down specific trees that were in the original pathway to the original manor. So these are the old trees from the manor times, and they have been preserved. And he had very specific plans or specific details on which kind of, or which trees were to be saved when the whole area was developed. So yes, I think I could show one example of Aalto's, a very big example of Aalto's work that's actually not so, how would you say, like nature friendly, if you want, because Aalto is very known for, at least in his later work, known for blending the nature, the environments to the buildings and the designs. So this is another kind of example. It's the example of the city center plan for Helsinki. He was commissioned the plan to plan the central area of Helsinki. And this is an area that many people who have visited Helsinki know, because it's been developed hugely in the recent years also. But I think the plans that are now in place, how the area is now being developed, somehow leans on this Aalto's design. Because I'm not sure if you can see here on this plane, here's the drawing of the Töölö Bay area. This is the water, and since early 20th century, we had plans of filling up the whole bay so that we could have more area to build on. But Aalto didn't do that, and I think it was not part of Aalto's plan. Aalto actually wanted to make this area a big, how do you say, like a metropole area of a modern city, so to speak. So he didn't want to imitate this nice romantic Karelian lake area, but he wanted to straight up the shoreline, and there was this idea of a line of cultural buildings in this side of the bay. And the only building that was realized from this plan is the Finlandia House, that is Finlandia Hall, that is maybe known to many people watching, maybe not. But I think the most remarkable part of this plan was that Aalto had planned this terraced plain on this side, on the southern side of Aalto, of the, what was this called? Töölö Bay area. So there was supposed to be parking spaces under those plains, and maybe some shops on this side. So it's a very different plan from what the Töölö Bay area now looks like. Although in early 90s there was the new opera house was opened here, which is the exact place where Aalto was had designed one of the buildings. It's not Aalto's building, but it's part of how the idea kind of moved on. And of course we have in 90s we had Kiasma, the modern museum, and then we had the music hall. So these big monumental cultural buildings are actually part of this plan originally. So maybe that's how it lives on. But I'm kind of glad, if I can say my personal opinion, I'm kind of glad that this is the child of its time. So I'm glad that we didn't have this big highway of cars coming down and these big parking places, that now there are these old wooden villas, and there's a lot of forest around the Bay Area. So it's very nice at the moment also. I think I can show some details of, we still have time for some details of other plans. Yeah, maybe this one is good to show. This is an example of the type of things that we have a lot of drawings that were never realized, that the buildings don't exist. And this is Aalto's entry to the competition of the Olympic Stadium, and this was never realized also, of course, because the other architects won the contest. But it's nice to see that this was the Aalto's plan for that area. I hope you can see some of the details of the beautiful drawings. And Aalto has this very nice typography also. The texts are very, very, how would you say, very characteristic to Aalto when he was writing on the drawing. And about that, he was very specific in many of his plans. Like this is the town plan, the town city plan for Salmetsalo in central Finland. And Aalto designed the area around the city hall and then the building of the city hall. The building is built, it's an existing building, and it's this terrace that is somehow like, it's this atrium type of image, that it's protected, the atrium yard is protected by walls. Maybe you can see in these pictures best. It's this beautiful atrium with the brickwork on the ground, and it's protected by walls so that it's kind of a nice area to be outside. Aalto was very, how would you say, very specific about the plants. He has, I'm not sure if you can see, but he has written all the Latin names of all the plants that were supposed to be planted in this garden. So very specific indeed, and some of them are even individually drawn in the plans. So I guess we don't have time for everything, and this was kind of the highlights of the exhibition. But I hope you got something out of it, and if you still have any comments or questions, you can post them here, or when we go offline, you can of course send them via direct message in Instagram, or post them in Instagram, or you can send us email or anything. We are glad to answer all of your questions that you have. And this is now the English tour, the end of the English tour, and we are going to have a Finnish a guided tour in Finnish in 1.5 hours at 3 o'clock. So I welcome everyone who maybe didn't see the whole tour, or want the tour in Finnish, or just want to recap everything I say. But yes, thanks for watching, and thanks for being on board.